What's going on, everyone? Welcome to episode 2 of Automotive MythBusters. I don't know if I fully like that name, so if you guys got any recommendations, let me hear them. First and foremost, everybody that watched, shared, commented on episode 1, I am truly thankful. I appreciate it. I definitely see it, and I try to comment back to every comment that I get. I did have somebody that wanted me to touch base on a topic on this episode, and I'm going to do so straight off the bat. So if you do have something that you want to see me talk about, let me know, comment down below, and I'll do my best to cover it. Going forward, I will say this, as I said in episode 1, I am trying to cram everything down in a short amount of time so it doesn't take an hour-long video to talk about 3 subjects. When I discuss stuff, I'm going to try to use a vehicle and example. Every vehicle is not the same. Every setup is not the same. So if you hear me talk about something, I got a topic today that's going to be a little bit of a broader topic. If you hear me talk about something and it doesn't necessarily hold truth to a certain vehicle, maybe that you know, or a project, I can't cover every single vehicle, every single application in every video, or else I'd be here talking for days. Hopefully you find these videos informative. That's my main goal here, is to educate you guys, share the knowledge that I have, and hopefully you enjoy episode number 2. Getting right into it. Wasn't really sure how to word this. I'm just going to spit it out, and here it goes. PSI is irrelevant to how much power your engine setup can hold. That's true. And let me explain what I'm talking about. I'm going to say this all started back around 1995, 1998-ish, when message boards were a big thing. With message boards, you're able to get information across and educate whoever had a question. Nowadays, you got Facebook, Instagram. People do ask questions, but usually the info is hard to research down the road if you're looking to get some help later on. So I believe this subject has popped back up, and I'm here to talk about it. So you might see a lot of times guys will post something, how much PSI can my setup hold? How much PSI can my block hold? We get the question asked a good amount of times, and PSI is irrelevant. So let me explain that. Now, let me go back really quick. I'm not telling you to run 40 PSI on a small turbo. To a point, PSI does come into the equation. But the proper question you should ultimately be asking yourself is, how much power can my engine hold? How much power can I put into it before I see a failure? And you got to go back and you got to educate yourself on a turbo. A turbo is going to flow CFMs, which is cubic feet per minute. That's the basic volume of how much that turbo is flowing. And I have 2 turbos here. So the first turbo I have over here is an RV6 turbo. Little shout out to RV6, awesome products. If you're looking and you're watching this video and you want some RV6 products, contact us, mention this video, give you a little bit of a hookup. The second turbo, a little bit of a bigger turbo. This is actually our name brand turbo. I'm gonna try to hold these up here and balance them. So now if you ask yourself, how much PSI can my block hold? Well, is 10 PSI on this turbo going to be the same as this turbo that is fairly larger? It's not. See, the thing with PSI is 10 PSI on a smaller turbo is not the same as 10 PSI on a larger turbo. That seems like common sense for people that have been in this industry for some time, but we're talking about new guys. We're talking about new guys that haven't ever built a boosted setup. This is their first time turboing, and this is where I believe where it kind of stems from. But even then, I've seen some guys with, a couple turbos under their belt, and they're still kind of gauging things off of the PSI. A turbo is going to flow different depending on the size, depending on the setup, and ultimately, if you take a smaller turbo compared to a bigger turbo, and you're shooting 10 PSI on it, of course, this bigger turbo is going to make more power. That's CFM. So ultimately, what you have to ask yourself is not how much PSI my setup can hold, but how much power. And when I go back to saying that, I'm going to break it down really quickly. You should figure out how much your block can hold, your actual engine block. You start with that. And when I say engine block, I mean your cylinder sleeves. Then you kind of also go back into it. How much can my crank hold? How much can my pistons hold? How much can my connecting rods that would hold the piston in place, how much can those hold? Every setup's going to have a weaker point. When we're talking about Hondas, a lot of guys think that they need to upgrade the cranks to an aftermarket crank. Honda cranks are good for about 1,000 horsepower, the OEM crank. Now, the connecting rods, different story. And every block's a little bit different. The brand new Honda 1.5s, they got very, very tiny little rods compared to, let's say, a K24 off of a TSX. The rods are going to be different. So you got to figure out where the weak point is in your spot the weak point in your build is. And then if you want to change it, you can go from there. We do get guys from time and time again where they're doing a simple build. They're throwing pistons and rods, and then they're going to boost, and they want to make 700-800 horsepower on the stock sleeves. The stock sleeves are only good to a certain point. Now, yes, you can push them, but the other thing is not to believe everything you see on the internet. Just because somebody did a dyno pull at 700 horsepower on stock sleeves doesn't mean that thing is going to last more than a couple days. When I'm tuning, I keep longevity in mind and everything else, unless it's a full-out race car. That's a different story. And as I said at the beginning of this video, we can't compare every single setup in this world when I'm talking about a certain subject. There's going to be some different stuff. So ultimately, if you're looking to turbo your car, you're brand new into the turbo scene, don't ask how much PSI your setup can hold, or your engine, how much can it hold. Figure out how much power it can hold. And honestly, if you have a fairly popular setup, as long as it's not an off-the-wall car and you want to be different, go on Google, do your research, you'll find the proper information, and you'll get what you need. And ultimately, if you're coming to us, as I said before, and I say it in many of my videos, reach out to us and we'll help you. But you got to support us so we can support you. I'd love to sit here all day and just be on camera or help people, but ultimately it doesn't pay the bill. So hopefully that kind of answered the question. Is PSI relevant to making how much power your block can handle? And it's not. Now, if you said how much PSI on a certain specific turbo size can it handle, it's a little bit of a different story. But to make things easy, just gauge it on how much power can my engine hold. On to our next topic, whatever you want to call it, going to be wastegates. I have a wastegate right over here just for demonstration purposes. As far as the actual myth goes, or how we see things, or what we hear and read, I can't go with this size wastegate because it's too large for my setup. Well, that's not true. Let me explain here a little bit. Now, of course, you want to properly size the wastegate to your setup. To keep things simple, we have 3 basic size wastegates. I don't have 3 of them here in front of me, so I can only demonstrate with this one. You have a 45 millimeter wastegate. Sometimes you'll see a 46 millimeter wastegate. It's just how the manufacturers will ultimately brand them, so they're different. But we're talking about the size right here. This ultimately is what we're discussing. So if you have a 38 millimeter, it's going to be a lot smaller. And of course, if you have a 60 millimeter wastegate, it's going to be a lot bigger. So I'm not telling everybody to go jump and buy a 60 millimeter wastegate. Most guys won't need that. But what I'm trying to get you guys to understand is what a wastegate ultimately does and why you really can't go too large. And most of the times when we see guys talking or whatnot, it's usually they're debating about either a 38, 39 millimeter wastegate or a 45, a 46 millimeter wastegate. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here. So ultimately, the job of this wastegate, there's a spring inside, whatever spring pressure you set. Let's just say there's a 10 PSI spring in this wastegate. You're going to hook it up to a vacuum source, vacuum/boost source. And when that vacuum boost source pushes 10 PSI, the wastegate spring is going to open up. And ultimately what it's going to do is instead of the exhaust gases going inside of the turbo to keep creating power, well, now this guy is going to open up. It's going to come out this side and it's going to stick to the PSI that you want. Well, in a perfect world it will, but there's such thing as boost creep and there's other stuff that plays into the equation. So as I was saying before, and I'll probably keep repeating myself, I really like to dumb things down. This guy versus this guy. The larger the turbo, you're going to want a larger wastegate. But ultimately, you can't go too large because the main job is this is trying to compete with this to control the amount of boost. And the bigger wastegate you're going to have, the better it's going to control. Now, before people start going into, well, this, and that, yes, there's other stuff that comes with the equation. And I have something else to discuss. Turbo manifold. We make these in-house. If you're looking for one, as I said in the other segment, give us a shout out. Mention this video. We'll give you a little bit of a deal. Wastegate placement. Now, you notice how this wastegate's going to come straight out the front, just like this. As the exhaust is going to be flowing through here out of the cylinder head, it's going to come through here. When this wastegate opens up, instead of the boost going down below into the turbo, it's going to come out the wastegate. It's fairly simple. What can happen that would affect how the wastegate wants to control? Well, placement. So I have a ram horn manifold right here that is not AC compatible. We do not make AC compatible turbo manifold. Sometimes, every now and then, if you're looking into like an AC compatible manifold, you'll have kind of like an elbow like this. That's going to point one direction. You're going to be able to clear whatever you need to clear in your AC setup. But ultimately, what are you doing? You're adding a length to where that wastegate's going to be placed. And now instead of going right into the wastegate, you're adding to it. Now, the other thing that sometimes you'll see, not in this style manifold, but maybe just a custom different manifold. Now, the exhaust is flowing this way. So, of course, the smoother you can make this transition, the better. If you had it like this, what do you think is going to happen then? Not only does that exhaust gas has to stop, then it has to make almost a 90-degree angle going upwards. The opposite way of how the exhaust is flowing downwards into the turbo. You talk about efficiency, the wastegate placement, that also comes into it. The dump tube can come into it a little bit as well. The dump tube, trying to explain everything to you guys. For the people that, you know, are really new into this, the dump tube would connect to this. So you got the manifold right here, wastegate connected. Then you got a dump tube that should be exiting somewhere out of your engine bay. Let's say though, your buddy makes you a dump tube, uses too thin of exhaust pipe, and also has a crazy sharp bend to it. So as soon as it comes out, it's just boom, it's going whatever which way. What do you think that's gonna do? That exhaust gas now is not gonna flow smoothly in and out like it should. So ultimately, to go back to the original question, can a wastegate be too big for your setup? Ultimately, the answer is no. I'm not encouraging everybody to go out and buy a 60 millimeter wastegate. That's not what I'm saying. Kind of giving you guys ideas that if maybe you're having a boost creep problem, to kind of think about the bigger picture. And ultimately, if you're in between, I will say like a 46 millimeter wastegate or a 60 mil. One big thing that comes into play with the 60 mil wastegate, and I wish I had one here, is the size. They're very, very large. So if you're stuffing everything in a crammed engine bay, most engine bays are fairly cramped to begin with, and then you're trying to stuff even a bigger 60 millimeter wastegate, you might not be able to get it to fit. Most guys, a 45, 46 millimeter wastegate will be good enough. But ultimately, we're going back on the main question, or the main myth that I mentioned. Can you go with too big of a wastegate? And the simple answer is no. But you want to size it up according to your setup and your project and whatnot. And I will say this, as I said it before, if you're not familiar with what you need, reach out to a shop that you can work with. Support that shop. I don't mind helping people out, and then they come and they buy the wastegate and whatnot, or whatever product it is, not just speaking about wastegate. But what I can't do and what we can't keep doing is offering the info, spending time on the phone, and then having people run straight to Amazon or eBay to buy the cheapest product. And then when something doesn't work, guess who they call for technical support? So support your shops locally, wherever you're at. Even if you're not local, we sell online, of course. We can help you out. Hopefully that answered some questions for you. Moving right on to our next topic. Do you need an IACV, an idle air control valve, to have your vehicle idle correctly? The answer is, I'm a little torn in this one. This one's kind of in the middle. Let me go into a little bit of detail and let me explain, and then you can kind of base everything off of what I'm talking about. So if you're not familiar with an idle air control valve, and I have two of them here. You're going to see these on your Honda, your B series, your D series, your H series. And then I also have one over here that's a K series one that you're going to see mounted on the throttle body. This one is mounted on the intake. An idle air control valve is simply a controlled vacuum leak to allow your car to idle correctly. Now, on these types that are mounted on the intake manifold, these two ports right here, these ports on the bottom have nothing to do with the way that the car idles. These are for coolant. These are to keep this thing from sticking in the cold weather. These two ports in the intake manifold will ultimately go into your throttle body ports. And on the other side of your throttle body, you have one hole. Sometimes you have two. You have one hole right here. This is going to be sucking in air through the throttle body ports itself, not the actual blade. So these ports, specifically this one right here. So it's going to be sucking in air. It's going to go in the intake, go in your engine, and that allows your vehicle to idle correctly. Do you necessarily need an idle air control valve to have your car idle? No. Do you need an idle air control valve to have your car idle and perform almost like a stock vehicle? In a sense, yes. So ultimately, there are ways to get your car to idle if you don't have an idle air control valve. You can go with some old school methods where you basically crack open the throttle plate a little bit. You can adjust either the throttle cable, you can adjust this little screw here. It's not ideal though. There's also other ways to do it inside of the tune. I'm not going to talk about that because it's going to really go off track, but there are some things that you can do to get the car to want to idle. Don't want to idle to begin with. Here's the problem. Most cars that we do are street-driven cars, ranging anywhere from almost completely stock with maybe an intake head or exhaust, but then having full setups that are boosted, making 500 horsepower. But those guys still want those cars to almost perform like a stock vehicle. Now, there's only so much you can do inside of the tune. There's only so much cracking this open a little bit is going to do. Ultimately, what you have to consider is how much the idle air control valve does besides just letting in the amount of air at a certain time. get in any vehicle and start it up. For the people that are in warmer states, this might be a little bit harder. But for the people that are in colder states, where you're seeing temperatures maybe below 40 degrees, get inside any car when it's cold and start it up and listen to how the idle is. The idle is going to be higher than it is when it's fully warmed up. That is your cold start idle. Your IACV is working more because it's flowing in more air to kick the idle up higher. And then as your car warms up, it's going to slowly drop even more, drop even more, drop even more, until it gets to the actual operating idle speed. Most vehicles are between 800, 900 in that area. The problem is, if you're just cracking this open with either that little screw that's down below here, or the throttle cable trick, or in the tune, there's only so much that this will actually do. So yes, you can get the idle to work and have your car idle, but in colder temperatures, unless you're going to go out there and adjust it even more, it's not going to want to idle when it's super cold out. Now, yes, you can ultimately step on your throttle pedal. You can feather the throttle to keep it alive, or do whatever you want to do. But you have to keep in consideration of what I said earlier. A lot of our guys, a lot of our customers want their cars to perform almost nearly like a stock vehicle would and still making power. So to go back on the question, can you run a vehicle and have it idle correctly to a point and not have an idle air control valve? Yes. But if you want it ultimately to be like a stock vehicle where you don't have to worry about the idle, you don't have to worry about keeping it alive when it's super cold out. We've had temperatures over here where it's negative 10 degrees. I think the last thing you want to be doing in your daily driven car is sitting in it when it's cold, trying to warm it up with your foot. And ultimately, I believe most guys block off the idle air control valve because it's the cheapest method to fix their problem that they're having. And either they're having a surging idle, they're having a higher idle, and ultimately they have an underlying issue that they need to address first. And usually it's a vacuum leak. Not all the time, but that's what it is. So ultimately, if your car is going to be on the street, you want the creature comfort or not having to sit it in it and throttle it when it's super cold out, run an idle air control valve. And if you're having ultimately, if you're having another issue where you have a surging idle or a higher idle, figure out why before blocking it off. So that is a wrap on episode 2. If you got to this point and you're still watching, thank you. If you got to this point and you're a little upset I didn't talk about something specific, simple. All you got to do is comment down below on what you want me to talk about next time, and I will do my best to cover it. I do have a little bit of a list of topics, so it might not be right away. I got to get to it. Ultimately, as I said before too, I'm trying to keep these videos to about a 15-minute length, give or take. Certain topics I can talk hours about. Certain topics I can go more in depth. That's not what I'm trying to do with these videos. I'm trying to keep it short and sweet, give you guys a little bit more info, knowledge, and educate, where ultimately you guys can take that, go on the internet, and do your own research. I know every single vehicle, every single project is going to be different, so some stuff I talk about is not always going to pertain to a specific vehicle or application. You got to just think overall. As we talked about in this episode, a 60mm wastegate is not for everybody. I'm not saying to go out and buy that, and I'm not saying if you don't have an idle air control valve that you absolutely need one to have your car idle. Hopefully you guys understand what I'm trying to accomplish in these videos. Thanks for watching. You guys ready for episode 3?